Okay, so we're going to look at Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation now. So you need to be aware of Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation and Romanian orphan studies, which look at the effects of institutionalisation. We'll start with the theory of maternal deprivation. So it's good to have an idea of what deprivation means. So deprivation is when a child is separated from their primary caregiver for a prolonged period of time and they're deprived of emotional or physical care from that primary caregiver. And this can affect a child's attachment. So deprivation during a critical period, which Bowlby stated was the first 2.5 years of a child's life, Bowlby said it would have harmful effects on a child's development, and it could affect them in a couple of different ways. So it could affect their intellectual development. So Bowlby believed that deprivation would lead to delayed intellectual development, so a low IQ. Research by Goldfarb found a lower IQ in children who had remained in institutions as opposed to those who were fostered. So if a child remains in an institution and if they are still deprived of that emotional and physical care from one primary caregiver, and they're not able to form an attachment. Whereas if a child is fostered, then they're given that one-to-one care, and if it's before the age of 2.5 years, then they might be able to form an attachment, and this could affect their intellectual development. Bowlby suggested it could also affect a child's emotional development. So Bowlby suggested that children who experienced emotional deprivation may develop affectionless psychopathy. This is the inability to experience guilt or strong emotion towards others, and this prevents a person developing fulfilling relationships. So we'll have a look at Bowlby's 44 Thieves study, which supports this idea that children could experience issues such as affectionless psychopathy if they are emotionally deprived from their primary caregiver. So the study that supports this is Bowlby's 44 Thieves study. It supports his maternal deprivation hypothesis. He looked at 44 children, and these children were referred to Bowlby because of issues such as stealing, and he compared them to 44 children in a control group who had emotional issues. So all of these children were referred to Bowlby in terms of his therapy sessions. Bowlby found that more of the thieves, so the 44 children who were referred to him because of stealing, had experienced frequently early separation from their mothers, and the ones that he categorised with having affectionless psychopathy, the separation was early, whereas the thieves who didn't have affectionless psychopathy, they didn't experience as many early separations with their mothers. And it demonstrates that there is a possible link between deprivation and later social or emotional problems. So he's saying that when he looked at this group of children, the ones that were referred to him because of stealing, he looked at them and he found that some of them had affectionless psychopathy. The ones that had affectionless psychopathy, when he looked at their experiences, he found that they had more frequent separations from their mothers when they were much, much younger, so within this critical period, compared to the thieves who didn't have affectionless psychopathy. So obviously, with regards to Bowlby's research, we do have some issues here. So he carried out the interviews himself, and he knew in advance which teenagers he expected to show signs of psychopathy because they had been referred to him previously. It raises the question of experimenter bias. So we have an issue here. Bowlby conducted the research. He'd already met these individuals before he carried out his research, and he was looking for support for his theory. So we've got issues there with bias. The other research, so Goldfarb's research, which looks at IQ, also had issues like confounding variables. So with this research, it was carried out on children of war, and these children had experienced early trauma and institutional care along with separation from their caregivers. So for the IQ research, you couldn't say whether it's because they were fostered, or is it because they remained in the institution, or was it because they'd lost multiple caregivers during the war? Is it because they'd experienced trauma during the war? So there's a lot of confounding variables there that haven't been controlled for in this research. Another limitation of Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory is that Rutter suggested that the damage that Bowlby linked to deprivation would be better explained using the idea of privation. So Rutter would suggest that there's a difference between deprivation and privation. Privation is when an attachment fails to form initially. So if there was a separation within that really early critical period and an attachment didn't form or wasn't able to form, then Rutter would say that was privation. And Rutter suggests that privation has these more severe effects, such as affecting IQ and affecting someone emotionally, whereas deprivation might not have as severe effects. Another limitation, so we have some research that opposes Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. This is research by Kulachova, which was a case study that looked at twins who were severely abused from the age of 18 months until they were 7 years of age. When they were 7 years of age, they were given excellent care, and they found that these twins had fully recovered emotionally and intellectually by their teens because they were given this one-to-one care. So this would suggest that maybe the critical period isn't as important, maybe it's just a sensitive period. And also, if we do ensure that an individual is given high quality care and education, then we might be able to reverse the effects of deprivation. So we have a lot of limitations with Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. However, there is some research to support his theory of maternal deprivation, and when we look at the effects of institutionalisation, it kind of mirrors some of these aspects that Bowlby talks about within his theory, such as it affecting intellectual development and emotional development. So we'll have a look at the Romanian orphan studies. So we've got two studies that we're going to look at here. We've got Rutter's research. So Rutter 2010, so it was 165 Romanian orphans who had suffered the effects of institutionalisation and had been adopted. So 111 were adopted before the age of 2, 54 were adopted by the age of 4, and they tested these children at regular intervals, so ages 4, 6, 11 and 15. And I think the most recent study looked at them in their 20s. And when they tested them, they assessed their physical, cognitive and social development, and they gathered information from interviews with parents and teachers to support the assessments. They found that at the time of adoption, the Romanian orphans scored lower than the British children, so they compared them to a similar group of British children. And they scored lower on all measures of development. However, by the age of 4, some had caught up with the children, the British children, and follow-ups have shown that some individuals, especially if they were adopted after the 6 months mark, it had effects on their attachment. So those who were adopted after 6 months, some of them showed poor attachment and had problems with peer relationships. So this could support the idea that there's a key point in time, a critical period that someone has to be adopted by to ensure that they are given the best opportunity to form attachments and the best opportunity to recover from the effects of institutionalisation. The second study, Zina et al., is the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. So within this, they assessed the attachment of 95 Romanian children aged 12 to 31 months who had spent most of their lives in care, so 90% of their lives in care. Attachment type was assessed using the strange situation, and carers were asked about behaviour to assess whether they had disinhibited attachment. A disinhibited attachment is when an individual is overly friendly to strangers, and this is because they're used to having multiple caregivers. They found that 745 of the control group were... Sorry, that should be 74%. They found that 74% of the control group were securely attached, 19% of the institutional group were securely attached, and they had a higher rate of disinhibited attachment, so 44% compared to the control group. So 74% of the control group were securely attached. When we compare that to the institutional group, only 19% of them were securely attached, and within the institutional group there was also a higher rate of disinhibited attachment. So if we look at the effects of institutionalisation, so institutionalisation can cause a disinhibited attachment to form, and this is where an individual is over-friendly and affectionate towards strangers. They have a lack of stranger anxiety, and this is an adaptation to living with multiple caregivers. It can also affect them intellectual and can lead to intellectual disability. So in Rutter's study, most children showed signs of intellectual disability when they arrived in Britain. However, most of those adopted by 6 months caught up with the control group by the age of 4. I will make sure I put a link to the Prezi for this so you can see the changes. So I'll change that to 74% there, and I'll put that on the Prezi for you so you can access that as well. So a strength of this research into institutionalisation: the study of Romanian orphans has improved psychologists' understanding of the effects of institutional care, so it allows for real-world application. So it's led to an improvement in the conditions that children experience in the care system. For example, ensuring that they only have, each key worker only has 1 or 2 children, or a child won't have more than 2 key workers, and these individuals will stay with this child for as long as possible and will be there to provide them with emotional care. They also try now to foster or adopt children where possible, and institutional care is the least desirable option. You get like emergency fosterers now as well, so when that child is taken into care within the first 24 hours, they might go to an emergency foster parent. So it's just ensuring that that child stays with a key person and is put into a safe, loving environment as early as possible. Another strength, the research has a lack of confounding variables. So do you remember Goldfarb's research? There were lots of confounding variables within that, and within lots of attachment research, children, especially who have, when we're looking at institutional care before Rutter's study, a lot of the children had experienced early trauma. But with regards to looking at Romanian orphans, a lot of the orphans had been handed over by loving parents who just could not afford to care for them. The children were wanted, and the children were loved and cared for by their parents. So it removes the variable of early childhood trauma. So we're focusing mainly on the effects of institutional care, not other confounding variables. However, there is a limitation. So the study by Rutter lacks adult data, and the long-term effects of institutional care are still unknown. And this is because it's a longitudinal study, so they can only collect data at certain points. And also you have an issue there with retention. So as the orphans get older, they may drop out of the study, and if they drop out of the study, then that could affect the results also. So for this topic, make sure you are aware of Bowlby's theory, what he says about deprivation, so like the intellectual and emotional effects, Bowlby's research to support that, so the 44 Thieves study, the Goldfarb study to support intellectual development, the issues with the theory and the issues with the research that supports it, so like experimental bias, and then make sure you know the Romanian orphan study, so Rutter and the Bucharest study, and the findings of those research, the procedures as well of the research, and also the evaluation points. Next, we'll have a look at the influence of early attachment on childhood and adult relationships.